Hey everybody, this is Abby Keegan with Cargill Feed Nutrition. I'm an equine nutritionist for ProElite, which is an ultra premium brand of horse feeds available here in the US. So excited to be with you guys. I actually have my master's degree in equine nutrition and have been consulting with veterinarians and horse owners and trainers and farm managers and you name it for about 16 years now. I did grow up with horses. I've been very fortunate my whole life here in the Midwest. I actually grew up showing quarter horses and the all-around events and showed 4-H, all those kinds of things. Most recently, I actually have 2 boys, and the oldest is interested in showing horses. He's been for a few years now, and he wanted to get into reiners. So we have started showing in the NRHA, the National Reining Horse Association. So tons of fun and have loved learning about all kinds of different competitive horses across the US. So, and their nutrition programs and how we can apply things across the board. So want to thank you guys for asking some great questions in the comments. Allie sent me a few of those this morning, and I've kind of grouped them a little bit together. A lot of you guys asked questions about gastric ulcers and building the horse's top line. How do we keep these guys from getting injured? Which the answer is we can't, right? So horses are sort of injury prone, or at least mine are, my show horses anyway. So we're going to talk about some of those things, and then we'll jump to your comments, any other questions that you guys post as well. So I guess where I wanted to start actually before we jump to gastric ulcers is just to do a little bit of level setting. So for example, one of the things I think you guys should know is myself as a nutritionist, what are some of the things that I'm going to look at as I get on farm, right? So if I'm asked to come and consult for a specific horse or a farm, what are some of the things that I'm going to ask you, and what do we need to know? So the first thing I want to know is the horse's body condition score. So body condition scoring, right, you guys maybe are familiar with this, is a way that we can assess the amount of fat or flesh that's on the horse's body. And we generally score them from a 1 through a 9 on the Henneke scoring system. And a 1 meaning that horse is very emaciated and thin. We can basically see every bone on that horse's body. And a 9 being, an obese horse, right? We've got flesh everywhere. And our goal really with these performance horses is to be somewhere in between that 5 and 6 of a body condition score. And so the reason, or what it tells us, I guess I should tell you first how you do that. So in general, what we're looking at is the flesh that accumulates over the crest of the neck, behind the horse's shoulder, across the ribs, and then on the sides of the tail head. But simply put, for the purposes of this Facebook Live, since I don't have any photos to show you, basically if you look across the horse's ribs, and if on a summer hair coat you can see any visible outline of ribs, we're below a body condition score of a 5. We're not talking about metabolic disorder horses here. That would certainly be different because we're accounting into those 4 areas. But in general, if we look at a horse, we can see a visible outline of ribs, we're not going to give them a body condition score of a 5 yet. Where they get to a 6 then is we can't see ribs on a summer hair coat, but we can find them. We can palpate across that horse's ribs and push a little bit and find them there. When we get to the point where we can't find ribs, which is when we get up above our 7s, that's when we start kind of thinking about maybe we need to pull away some calories. So big picture, why is it important? Why do we want to know body condition score? Does it tell us, is the horse's diet balanced? And the answer is no. The reason we want to know the body condition score is simply, does the horse have enough calories in the diet? Does he have too many calories in the diet? So that is all body condition scoring tells us, is the caloric content of their diet. It does not tell us if we've got enough amino acids. It doesn't tell us if we have enough copper and zinc, vitamin E, anything like that. So all it tells us is if we have enough calories in the diet. But it's really important for us to understand. The second thing I'm going to look at is the horse's top line evaluation score. And so this is a system that we came up with years ago, our team, where we're evaluating the lean muscle tissue along the horse's top line. So surrounding and supporting the spine, kind of like our core, right? What surrounds and supports our spine is very similar in the horse, and you guys are all familiar with the horse's top line. And so where we're looking is the muscle along the withers, the back, the loin, and then also along the croup as well. And so if any of those areas are deficient in muscle, we don't feel like there's adequate muscle surrounding and supporting the spine there, then we're going to say that that horse is not sufficient in amino acids. And we've got a whole scoring system from A through D that we utilize for that. And we can maybe do a sideline on that one sometime. But essentially what it's telling us, again, is does the horse have enough amino acids in the diet? And we might, I might go to a farm and they're feeding a phenomenal product, and maybe they're even following the manufacturer directions. But if they've gotten a load of hay in that's well below normal, I've seen some forages this year that are in the 6 and 7% crude protein. It gets pretty tough to use most feeds on the market without some kind of supplementation to meet those amino acid needs. And thus the top line is going to tell us that. So that's kind of that second piece. And then the third one that I can't go without is knowing what that horse's body weight is. And ideally, right, we could run them across a scale, but not all of us have a scale on farm. I'm lucky because I'm an equine nutritionist, so I get to have one. But there's a couple ways that you can actually get a body weight simply by doing some math and using a soft measuring tape. So, and the reason that we want to know the horse's body weight is because in order to feed that horse correctly, we've got to know how much the horse weighs to do the math. It's sort of like if I'm dosing a medication for an animal or things, I've got to know the body weight, right, in order for the ingredients or the medicine to be effective. So it's the same concept. So one of the ways you can actually get your horse's body weight if you don't have a scale is by using a soft measuring tape. And you simply wrap it around the horse's heart girth right up over the wither, basically where the end of the mane hairs are, and then right where your girth would go behind that front leg. So you're just pulling it kind of taut, and it's going to get a measurement in inches, right? So maybe it's 78 inches for a heart girth. And then we're measuring the horse's body length, and we're going from the point of the shoulder. It's not a blanket measurement. So the blanket measurement, we're coming to the inside of the chest. This is a body length measurement. So we're using the point of the horse's shoulder and going back around to the point of the horse's buttock. And that's our body length measurement. And then it's simply taking the heart girth times itself times the body length and dividing it by 330. And that equation, if you've got the horse standing square, will get you a really good estimate, usually within that 20-pound marker. And so it works really nicely because then we know, roughly what does that horse weigh and how do we need to feed it accordingly. So those are kind of three, off the top things that I've got to know in order to appropriately come in and then think about, where am I sourcing calories from? What is this horse doing? What kind of a history does it have? Do we have any metabolic disorders? All those other questions. But without those first three pieces of knowledge, it can get pretty tough to kind of go from there. So that's where I like to start. So let's talk a little bit about gastric ulcers. So as you guys know, historically horses were built to have many, many, many small meals throughout the day, right? They roamed long periods of time and many miles, and they nibbled on this pretty lackluster forage that probably was available back then, but they were consuming something constantly. And so in today's environment, that gets a little bit more challenging, and we have to come up with some creative management solutions and really think about how we're feeding them today. So, ulcers, basically, right, we're talking about the horse's stomach. So as the esophagus, right, they're consuming the feed through their mouth, it flows in through the esophagus into the stomach. And the top portion of the horse's stomach is that non-glandular mucosa. So it does not handle acidic environments very well. The bottom portion is the glandular mucosa, and so it's a pH of like 1 to 2. That tissue is better supported for that really acidic environment. And so naturally, when a horse consumes something, it's chewing, right? And it produces saliva. And so saliva is kind of number one. If we can encourage saliva production, we're doing good here. And the way a horse is going to produce saliva is not by thinking about food. It's actually molar contact, right? So they're chewing. So anything we're feeding them, they're chewing, they're producing saliva, which obviously is flowing down into the stomach and serves as that natural buffer. So our saliva is the best thing there. The horse's saliva, rather. So saliva, I think, is a pH around 8.71 or something like that. So it's pretty basic, right? So it's a nice buffer. So again, if we can keep them chewing, what are creative ways that we can do that? So hay, right? Forage should be the foundation of the horse's diet. And so if we think about, normally if we're feeding them 2 meals a day, maybe your horse gets 3 meals a day, we're putting, flakes of hay on the ground or however they're fed. And now we have these wonderful things years ago, right, that we came out called nibble nets or small hole hay nets that are about, an inch to an inch and a half size little square openings that we can place our forage into. And the University of Minnesota actually did some really nice studies looking at, okay, well, how long does it take a horse to consume their hay, right? Because we're talking about having them chew hay longer periods of time throughout the day. They used to chew hay or chew forages and graze for 18 hours a day. And what they found was that a normal allotment of forage in the morning and at night in their stall, not in a hay net, took about 3 hours for them to consume each. So about 6 hours a day versus 18, right? Not good. We've got a lot of time where the horse's stomach is exposed to acid. There's nothing in there to buffer it, and it's not producing saliva by chewing. And so they used these 1 1/4 inch nets, and what they found was it would take the horse about 6 hours in the morning and 6 hours at night. So 12 hours a day, right? So we're getting much, much closer to that 18 hours of what's happening in nature. So if we can use hay nets, and I know that they can be a little bit of a pain, right? They are work. It does require someone to manual labor, and my sons and my husband would complain about the hay nets that I use here and having to stuff them full of hay. I try to be nice and, go fill a few of them so they're ready to go for the next few days, but they don't always last. So it might be a good discussion, and some of the barns that I've talked with across the US and managers and folks who actually feed the horses, if you think about, is there a way you can ask them to do that, and maybe even in compensating them, because it is extra labor, it is extra cost to take that time to put the hay in the net. But when you think about how it slows your horse's consumption down and keeps them chewing more hours out of the day and buffering that stomach acid, in comparison to medications and surgeries and treatments and things like that, it probably is pretty limited. So something to think about. Another thing we talk about from a buffering aspect is using alfalfa hay. So we know from several studies that including, a couple pounds of alfalfa hay per feeding will actually have this really nice buffering effect, and we've seen reduced ulcer scores. So it's due to the calcium content, a little bit, they think maybe the magnesium and the protein level as well in the alfalfa hay. So if we can incorporate some alfalfa into the diet, that works really nicely to buffer. If you don't have alfalfa hay available, there's also some feed-through buffers that are now becoming available. So there's some marine-derived calcium sources that are a different form of calcium that works more from a buffering aspect versus actually nutrients. The thing to think about or remember with those, and they're wonderful, they do actually have a buffering effect just like alfalfa hay, but we have to remember that every 2 to 3 hours, the horse's stomach is going to empty. So if we feed a buffer or a meal of alfalfa and that horse goes 6 hours without eating anything, it's long been emptied and that effect is gone. And so we really have to think about how do we continuously supply these things? Are we coming out every 2 to 3 hours and supplementing? Maybe not, but is there a time in the morning when we can and we can have alfalfa and a nibble net or something? That might be a better game plan if that works out. So the other thing is any kind of forage or feed coming into that stomach. So again, we talked about really that glandular portion is meant to have the high or the low acid the acidic environment, the low pH. It's getting late in the day here. And that top portion is where we want to prevent any kind of sploshing from occurring, right? So if we think about the horse's stomach, if we go to put them into work, right, they're bouncing around, they're hopefully lifting themselves, maybe they're taking jumps, whatever they're doing, and that acid can splosh up into that upper non-glandular portion. And so obviously then we can have ulcers created. So how do we minimize that, right? So we can look at buffering effects, or we can look at having some kind of a feed mat in there. So have we fed hay, and gotten some into them before we go to ride them, right? Or are we riding them on an empty stomach? So something to think about. It's that feed mat can really help out by buffering from that capability as well. The second thing we want to think about is controlling starch in the diet. So we know that our goal is keeping the total grams of starch per meal below 1 gram of starch per kilogram of body weight per meal. So what does that mean, right? That sounds like a lot. Well, basically what we would do is we would go and look at our feed tag, and hopefully your feed tag, whatever you're using, should have a dietary starch maximum listed on the label. If they don't, you can call the manufacturer, but hopefully they're starting to list that for you. It's a really nice guarantee to say, this is the maximum dietary starch that would ever be formulated into this feed, because we know, right, every ingredient that we pull, even if we're using the same ones in every batch of feed, they're grown in nature. And so they're naturally going to have different nutrient levels. And we've got to make sure we're accounting for that in our production facilities and in our formulation. So measuring those is key. So what we would do is want to understand, what is that dietary starch max? And we would convert that by how much we're feeding in a meal. So for example, if we are feeding a 1,400 pound horse 7 pounds, let's say, of a 20% starch feed, right? It's got a max of 20% dietary starch. So we would take 20% or 0.2, multiply it by that 7 pounds, and then multiply that by 454 to convert it to grams. And then we would divide that amount of grams of starch by the horse's body weight in kilograms. So I've hopefully not confused you, but essentially that's how we come up with that number. So that particular example I gave you is the very max we would ever want you to feed a horse to stay below that 1 gram of starch per kilogram of body weight per meal. So no more than 20% starch in the feed, and no more than 0.5% of the horse's body weight in a meal. So ideally we're feeding something with a little bit less starch, even 18%, 13, 10, a lot of them are. But more importantly, how many pounds in the meal? So if we had to feed this feed that was 20% starch, because sometimes we have these performance horses that we've got to replenish their muscle glycogen with starch, a lot of our jumpers, for example, we would want to make sure that we stayed below that 0.5% of body weight in a meal to make sure that we're not feeding them more than 1 gram of starch per kilogram of body weight. So hopefully that makes some sense, and please ask questions if it doesn't. A couple other things then. So third, I guess, is really around reducing stress. And you guys are like, wow, we have performance horses. That's pretty tough, right? So if we think about, herd mates, maybe there's a horse in the barn that's driving them nuts, or maybe they prefer to be by somebody else. Think about how we're stalling these guys. Can we move them around to make them less stressed and more comfortable? Can we out time? Can we hand walk them? Things like that. Because they are stalled most of the time, these competition horses, and it can get a bit challenging. When it comes to travel, that was one of the questions that came up. What do we do with these horses? And I hope you're still able to travel. I think that was a question that maybe Jess and Maria, one of you guys had that question. Hopefully you're still able to travel, but in general, kind of getting a pre-travel game plan together is a great idea. A couple weeks ahead of time at least. I would definitely have that conversation. You mentioned Gastriguard with your veterinarian. A lot of horses, we are, pre-dosing or kind of giving that preventive dose of, I think it's 1 milligram per kilogram body weight before we haul them. So a couple days before, during the haul, and then maybe a couple days afterwards as well. But I think it's important to think about too that, right, that is a proton pump inhibitor. We're stopping that acid secretion or slowing it down. But once we take them off of it, right, the cycle is going to happen over again. And so how do we have that tissue ready? How do we have that horse maybe more acclimated? So a couple things from a nutrition standpoint is really minimizing change. And I know that sounds tough, right? We're changing environment and all those things, but how can we keep their diet as consistent as possible? So one of the things I ask folks to do is to investigate what you've got for a hay supply. Can you get a hold of enough bales of hay or however your horse is being fed to get that horse acclimated to that particular crop or cutting a couple weeks ahead of time throughout the haul, and then for a couple weeks while you're at your new facility, or at least a week to slowly transition them over. Horses' digestive systems, a lot of times we talk about changing feed, and we're all taught that, I think, Pony Club or however we're taught as youngsters. But changing hay actually has a huge impact on these horses as well. And you might say, oh, well, he's always fed this XYZ grass hay from maybe this one farmer. And I confess, my husband is actually a farmer, raises all of my forage, and I get to be the hay snob. So it's not all the same, even if it comes from the same supplier. Every single cutting from a field is going to be different depending on the maturity of that forage. So if you can get a hold of something to at least have that be a consistent part of their diet, I think that's a really nice piece. The horse's microbiome that we talk a lot about. So we're talking about the bugs in their gut, right? How acclimated are they to digesting whatever it is that we're feeding them? And so by keeping that consistent, that's one less thing that has to get upset in the horse. Another thing would be to think about feeding before loading. So making sure that, again, we talked about kind of that protective mat in the stomach. So if we can make sure before, the hauler gets there, or maybe you're trailering themselves, that they've had their meal, they've eaten enough hay, they've kind of got that protective mat in there. And then go ahead and load them on the trailer and take off. Obviously we want the trailer, to be equipped with some kind of the forage that we were talking about. So hopefully the forage that you've gotten a hold of, maybe it has some alfalfa in it for some extra buffering capacity, would be great. So depending on, the hauler, if there's some kind of a feed tub in the trailer itself, if there's a hay bag that we can use, talk with them ahead of time, get creative, however it is that you've got to have it, so you can have forage in front of these guys the entire trip. A lot of people will haul with hay cube or, alfalfa cubes or alfalfa pellets as well, if that makes more sense in the situation. But again, have them chewing, making that molar contact, producing saliva, throughout the entire trip the best we can. So, even thinking about pre-diet or pre-hauling, their diet, right? So making sure everything is balanced out and talking with someone about that. Electrolytes are another good one. So if you have a horse who is not a great drinker or balks at the idea of drinking something besides their own home water, you might start thinking about adding in some kind of a flavoring, an electrolyte, or, some people will use Gatorade or Kool-Aid, things like that. I've heard of all kinds of different creative ideas, but something to put in the water at home so they start getting used to that taste. And then that way when they're, being hauled and offered a different kind of water, it's not such a big jump for them. So, and then I was talking about, or kind of thinking about this in my mind, practice. So, we're in a different time now where some of us have more time for their horses, and unfortunately some of us, maybe are quarantined from the barn and aren't allowed to go see our horses, which I feel for all of you that have that situation. But if you are able to, and maybe your shows are canceled and you're not able to go, maybe it's time that you could spend with your horse, getting them more acclimated to travel. So maybe, the only time you currently are able to jump on the trailer is when you're heading to a horse show, right? You're in a hurry, everybody's stressed, we're running around, things are crazy. So how can we start making those experiences where you're getting on the trailer with the horse is sitting on there for a few hours or something eating, getting used to it, making that experience okay. So I kind of liken it to, I wasn't a great flyer early on in my career. I didn't like flying in airplanes. And the more you do it, right, the better you get at it. And if you can hang around somebody who's nice and calm, that certainly helps as well. So same principles can apply. So the fourth thing then is to think about selecting a feed to nourish the lining of the stomach. So a feed or diet balancer, I should say. A couple different things. So making sure we've got enough amino acids in the diet. Obviously, amino acids are critical when it comes to tissue and lining of our digestive system. Another one is pre and probiotics. So looking for a product that does have prebiotics, which are essentially their food for the good bugs that exist in the horse's gut. And again, those are our friends. That's the microbiome, right? Is this population of bugs, I'm going to say in air quotes, and keeping them happy. Probiotics that are added in the feeds, again, are basically adding good live bugs to the feed and to the horse's gut. So they would be something where you'd look at the tag and look for CFUs or colony forming units to see if they are live and viable, and talk with the manufacturer and make sure they're doing something or using a form of probiotic, because there's a lot of probiotics on the market that don't work, but that are actually encapsulated and designed to survive that pelleting process. So that's another key one. Another piece you could look for, again, that it's going to support that stomach lining or nourish it, would be organic complexed zinc in the feed. So again, zinc is a big driver of that tissue lining and integrity. We starting to learn more and more in these last few years about leaky gut syndrome, and basically what happens is the tight junctions that hold the microvilli together can break apart and allow pathogens to come through where they shouldn't. And so we've seen that in heat-stressed animals, adding a better bioavailable form of zinc can actually help these guys in some cases. So that's another one to think about. And then I know this one sounds really simple, but feeding to the manufacturer's directions. So we spend a ton of time putting together these diets and, look at the best forages and the worst forages and where do our feed rates need to be to make sure that when you feed to a horse's body weight, that horse is getting everything it needs to balance out the forage. And so that's one ask I guess I would have of everybody, is to go to the barn if you're able to, and once you know your horse's weight, grab the bag of feed or diet balancer, look at the tag directions, and make sure that your horse is getting the proper amount for his body weight. The other key thing to think about there is maybe talking with your manufacturer and how is that feed designed, right? So the feeding directions, are they designed to make sure your horse stays out of a deficiency, which is very different from making sure they have optimal nutrition for performance. So those would be a couple things to think about there. Next, I want to talk about building top line. So that was one of the questions that was asked. Top line, obviously, when we think about building the horse's top line, we think about things like saddle fit. We think about exercise, right? That's the number one that comes to everybody's mind. We think about genetics. What's the potential for that horse? Are they going to have a halter horse top line, or are they going to have a thoroughbred top line? And then nutrition. And I'm here to tell you, nutrition is that foundational component. And I think it was Jessica that asked that question, and you were right, nail on the head, that nutrition has to be there. So, so many times I hear, well, this horse just, hasn't been put back in work, or, that's why his top line looks like that. And exercise is definitely a component of the horse's top line and building it. But nutrition has to be there. So we always like this analogy of, I can go to the gym and I can, pump iron or lift weights, but if I go home and I eat lettuce and I drink water, I'm never going to build muscle, right? I've got to have the amino acids there to do that. We've done a lot of different research trials at different universities, specifically around amino acid nutrition. And we always do them where we have sedentary horses, right? So they're not being worked. We take exercise out of the equation. And so it's really fun because, I've even had grad students that have said, I'm just worried this isn't going to work. We're not going to build any muscle, right? We're not exercising these horses. And so it's a great learning opportunity for everyone that yes, we can build muscle without exercise. Can we make it even better with exercise? Absolutely. So the best combination is amino acids being met in the diet, exercising those horses, and making sure there's enough calories as well. That's one thing sometimes I'll come across is that the diet just doesn't have enough calories for those amino acids to be effective. So that's another piece to think about. In those studies that we do, we actually measure the horse's longissimus dorsi, which again are those two huge muscles that run on the sides of the spine, kind of over the back and loin. Right, they're pretty important to the horse's top line. You guys are sitting on them when we're sitting on a saddle. So those are what we actually measure. And we measure that depth of that loin muscle and how much we can improve and increase it with an ultrasound probe. So pretty fun stuff. And we know that we can do that with just diet. Our most recent one, we actually looked at two different feeds, like the control diet, which was a 14% protein. And it was compared with a treatment diet, which was our product, which was also 14% protein. So they were isonitrogenous, or same protein, and then isocaloric. So we had the same digestible energy or calorie levels in both of them. And the only difference, right, was we had our proprietary amino acid package in our product, and then a couple of functional metabolites and pre and probiotics. And so what we did is we looked at that lean tissue deposition. So we measured the horse's longissimus dorsi with an ultrasound. And what we saw was, even though they were both eating a 14% crude protein diet and they both had the same amount of calories, the horses that were on the treatment diet had drastically, I think it was over twice the top line that they put on in 56 days. So pretty neat to see, the impact that can have. So all in all, getting back to what are some things that you can look for. So obviously on your feed tag or diet balancer tag, you can look at, again, the crude protein level will always be listed, but look below that for those key amino acids. So lysine, methionine, threonine, tryptophan, at adequate levels to help support building that horse's top line. Another misnomer is, should I just add fat to the diet, right, to build the top line? And the answer to that is possibly, but no, that's not going to build it, right? So the top line is made of muscle. Fat, right, doesn't start to apply over the horse's back or top line until we get that horse over about a body condition score of a 7, which at that point is we're getting to obese. We're getting closer there, right? Where I was going with adding fat to the diet. So once we've got our amino acids addressed and we are exercising that horse, if we find that we're still not seeing what we want, sometimes adding a fat supplement in as a calorie source can actually benefit. So we're kind of pairing those three aspects together. Kind of some interesting information too is, so again, we look at that top line, as I mentioned in the beginning, the top line evaluation score. The reason it's so critical is that if we think about all the other structures in the horse's body that are made of protein, it's pretty amazing. So the horse's hoof, for example, if we take all of the water out of the horse's hoof, it's 95% amino acids, right? So many times we think of all these hoof supplements and things, and what mineral do I need to add, and biotin, and so on and so forth. And not that those aren't important, but the most critical, if we think about the composition, right, is protein or amino acids. The horse's skin, for example, 90% amino acids. So we want good quality skin and a good quality hair coat. We've got to have a high quality amino acid diet. There was a question as well about shiny coats, and that was around sunflower seeds or sunflower oil. So to get a shiny coat, as I just mentioned, the amino acid piece of it is huge. So making sure those are addressed in the diet. The second thing is actually looking at like zinc levels and copper levels, so making sure those are adequate. If you look for an organic complex source of zinc and copper, that's kind of a key piece as well. And then you mentioned fat, so what's our fat source? And certainly sunflower oil can add fat to the diet or calories, but when we look at that omega-3 to 6 or 6 to 3 fatty acid profile or ratio, sunflower seeds actually, the oil actually is higher in omega-6s versus 3s, unlike your flaxseed or chia seeds or something like that. So generally we would try to stick to those others. Now certainly, if they're used as a combination in some kind of a professionally formulated fat supplement that has some sunflower oil in it, that's probably okay if they're using maybe some flax or chia or something like that to balance out that omega-6 to 3 fatty acid profile. But in general, by themselves, they're not as great of a choice. Some other aspects, we talked about amino acids and protein. I didn't really explain what they were. So protein, right, is made of amino acids. Those are the building blocks. And there are actually 10 essential amino acids, which means the horse can't manufacture them themselves. You've got to feed those in the diet. And so that's what we're talking about, right? There are 21, and most of those are made by the horse, but there's those 10 that are essential that we've got to feed to the horse. So again, lysine, methionine, threonine, tryptophan. You guys might be familiar as well with things like the branched chain amino acids, so leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Some of our products, we're starting to put more whey protein concentrate in, which is a great source of those branched chain amino acids. So you might just start to see some of those supplements out there. And that rolls back into your question about building top line. So once you've kind of got that base addressed with your forage, then you might want to go to using, if you're still not seeing the results based on that, you could certainly go to using something that has those branched chain amino acids in it to further drive building. Leucine is a big one. Another question that came up was around these older horses or horses that are aging and thinking about how do we prevent them from injuries, getting hurt in the show pen, things like that. And I wish I had a magic answer for you. As a mother of 2 sons, I've purchased several older show horses. And my gosh, I wish some of them, that I would have had the fortune to have fed and cared for earlier on in their career. And it makes you wonder how much longer could you, hold on to them and keep them active and competing. So, I think the answer is different across the individual, but again, I would take it back to the foundation of things. So keeping them at a really healthy body condition score, not letting them get obese. So many of our horses, and I'm just as guilty as anybody, we like to see that flesh, don't we? We like to see them have that nice, round, beautiful appearance. And so where I've kind of gone to with my own show horses is I'm okay with that for a certain time period, maybe my peak of my competition season. But after that, I'm going to let them kind of come back and I'm going to peel some of those calories off of them. I still want to maintain nutrients though. This is where I would say 99% of the problems come into play. If we peel back feed, for example, we, yes, are taking away calories, but if we get below the manufacturer's feeding directions, that poor horse is now deficient in amino acids, trace minerals, vitamins, right, that are not in the forage. And so I think a lot of our horses that we show and compete with kind of go through these phases where, they got too fat. Oh, I'm going to peel back how much I'm feeding them. Well, maybe I'm limiting calories, but now I'm really limiting my nutrients. And I can't see that in the horse, right? That's not going to show up visibly with my eyes. I can't see that horse is zinc deficient or amino acid deficient until it gets bad enough. And so if I can kind of take that proactive approach and start to look at the diet holistically, based on, again, what's their body condition score, what's their top line score, how much do they weigh, and how much have I got to use of that particular product that I'm trusting. So those are some key pieces. In addition to that, for me, certainly, amino acids, I keep going back to that. Some of the research has shown that these older horses don't sort of build protein or muscle, right, the way that the younger ones do, or even in the human population. And so sometimes it takes a more bioavailable source or more. And again, that's where those branched chain amino acids can sometimes come into play. But making sure we've got enough in their diet is critical. The horse's tendons are 93% protein when we pull all the water out of them. And so if we think about it, if a horse is showing us in their top line that they are deficient in amino acids or short any kind of muscle supporting an area of the top line, that means the diet is deficient in amino acids. And that means what about the tendons, right? Because they're comprised of them. So something to think about, that, that could be a big, huge part of it. Once those aspects are addressed and we've got a healthy body condition, we know we've got enough feed or balancer going into them to balance out the forage, then that's where we can start to think about, does it make sense to be on some kind of a joint supplement that's trusted, whether it's glucosamine or whatnot. So that's another place you can go. Other things to think about would be, the calorie sources that we're using. So are we choosing to use more starch and sugar or more fat and fiber for those horses? What are our omega-6 and 3 fatty acids look like in the diet? So targeting feeds that maybe list a guaranteed level of omega-3s and omega-6s, and doing the math there to look at the ratio. So ideally, our feeds, our total diet, there is no requirement, I should state that up front yet. The research hasn't gotten us there. But we do know staying ideally, the rules are kind of around 10-1 or below from a 6-3 standpoint. Ideally more like 5-1 below. So looking for those feeds that have kind of that ratio or lower is ideal, because obviously we know that our forages are going to have more omega-3s in them than 6s. So that helps us to balance things out from a total dietary perspective. So I'm going to jump to any comments, and I am going to confess that this is my very first Facebook Live, if I hadn't told you guys that. So have spoken to lots and done lots of meetings, but not Facebook Lives. Oh, okay. So COVID-19 vacation. So Sophie had asked this question, and I think it's a great one. So if your horse, you're not allowed to go to the barn anymore, or things have just changed, and I know our show seasons have kind of been blown up and all those things. So maybe things have changed for your horse, and now you're not going to be working them as hard. So what can we do, right? So I think, first and foremost, right, we've got to think about reducing our calorie intake. So if you are feeding something that is designed to be fed at a higher level, and we start cutting back the feed as the calorie source. So say we were feeding, a 1,400 pound warm blood, 10 pounds a day or something like that. And the manufacturer's directions say we've got to feed at least 7, but we cut them back to, let's say 4, because we don't need that many calories anymore. Well, now, yes, we're still feeding that lovely product that we were using before, but we're only feeding 4 pounds, and the manufacturer's directions, if we do the math, say at least 7 for maintenance. So we've got to find either something to supplement that with, or we've got to change up to another product. And so something I do with a lot of clients is put them on a diet balancer. If you guys aren't familiar, and hopefully you are, diet balancers are basically very concentrated forms of feed. They're typically very high in protein. Some have really good amino acid profiles. And so they can be fed at a much lower feeding rate. So a 1,400 pound horse may only need 2.5 pounds a day of a diet balancer versus maybe 7 of a traditional feed. So that would be a great place to go. Still making sure that they've got enough, forage coming in. Ideally, we want these horses eating about 1.5% of their body weight in hay per day. If they're still, they're not doing anything and they're hanging out and they've really reduced their calories that much, maybe we need to consider weighing out the hay and finding out, okay, how many flakes really is 1.5% of their body weight, and how much, that's the minimum they would go through. And then again, putting in a nibble net, a small whole hay net, so we can slow down their consumption and have them chewing throughout the day. I had to laugh. You guys came up with some great explanations. We had Tubby, Blimp, Easy Keeper, all kinds of good ones. So again, reduce calories with those guys, and maintain the optimal nutrients that are coming in. And that way, when all of this is over, or at least we've gotten used to our new normal world, maybe the show seasons start up again, things like that, or we're able to go back to the barn. Your horse isn't deficient in nutrients. So again, nutrients meaning amino acids, meaning trace minerals, meaning vitamins. We're not just talking calories here. So I think that's a huge piece to make sure these horses are ready to go back to work. Someone had asked too about pent up energy. So again, that is going to depend on the form of calories that you're feeding. So if you're feeding something high in starch and sugar, yes, they're probably going to have some more pent up energy. Or even if you're not, they've got to have adequate calories to maintain body weight, but we might have to find a different form of turnout or some other situation that the barn can put them in to release some of their pent up energy. What other questions? So Kelly asked about her 8-year-old Hanoverian Hunter gelding. Oh, she's feeding ProElite Top Line Advantage, as well as a typical grain performance feed. Always wondered if I should cut back on his regular feed since I add the top line. He's getting a bit too chunky. So great question. So an 18-hand Hanoverian Hunter gelding, I'm going to guess he probably weighs close to 1,500 pounds. He may weigh more than that. I'd be curious to know. But for his body weight, basically 1,000-pound horse, we want eating, that's in light work, 1 pound a day of ProElite Top Line Advantage for 1,000-pound horse will meet all their nutrient needs that are missing in the forage. So in your case, if you're 1,500 pounds, that'd be 1.5 pounds a day. So if you're feeding 1.5 pounds a day of the ProElite Top Line Advantage, and you're feeding this high performance grain, and you're thinking you're getting a little bit chubby, your horse is getting a little chubby, what you can do is go ahead and just start to cut back that performance grain, and monitor body condition, see what you're looking like every week or two. And yes, you're correct. You don't need the performance feed. We're basically looking at that as your calorie source, right? You're supplying all your nutrients through the ProElite Top Line Advantage. I should also mention you're also supplying some nice branched chain amino acids as well. So hopefully he's got a great top line on him. Another question. So Aaron has a 7-year-old thoroughbred jumper who's a hard keeper. Trouble keeping a top line on him, and he gets ribby. So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, right? So top line, so he needs more amino acids or a better quality source. And then he gets ribby. So by ribby, you're meaning I can see ribs, right? So we know his body condition score is below a 5. He's also prone to ulcers, but goes bonkers on alfalfa. So I've had this a few times, and I think the piece we have to remember is obviously we need to increase his calories and increase his amino acids in the diet. And so what we would think about doing is adding calories in the form of fat versus starch and sugar. So fat and soluble fiber. Now alfalfa hay is not traditionally high in sugar. It's fairly moderate, but it does have a lot of calories in it. So the alfalfa might help him gain weight, and maybe he starts to go bonkers, but I always warn folks to think about what are his genetics, right? We're all wired a bit differently. And so it may just be his normal is, this more hyper anxious, he's got more energy. And we don't want to deprive him of that. So we've got to think about how's everybody wired and what is their normal supposed to be. So it may not be the alfalfa making him so crazy. It's just that it's more calories, and now he's getting to where he feels good and he's got enough energy in him to be his true normal. So I get that question quite a bit, and I think it's something to think about with our horses. Again, the type of feed you would use is something, probably not a diet balancer, but you'd probably want to go to more of a traditional type of feed that's higher in fat. So maybe something that's more like 12% fat. Again, make sure it's got a good quality protein, amino acid levels. Look for those lysine, methionine, threonine, hopefully even tryptophan is listed. And feed it to the manufacturer's directions. But something built like that would be a nice fit. You'd also look at the starch and sugar content. Generally, anything that's going to be, that high in fat is going to be lower controlled in starch and sugar. Again, you can find dietary starch on the tag, and then the sugar content as well. Those are non-structural carbohydrates. Another good thing to look for him. That brings us to, someone had asked about metabolic disorder. I think somebody had a pony with Cushing's, if I recall. So Cushing's or pituitary pars intermediate dysfunction, PPID. These guys, I think I had previously found, there we go. Easy keeper, it sounds like. So good body condition score, maintained on a dry lot. Yes, dry lot. So these guys, again, are a great candidate for a diet balancer. So very small amount that the minis would have to consume, very, very low in starch and sugar. So ideally we should be looking at the feed tag again for the starch and sugar, add the two together and find something that is well below kind of that 15% is what I generally target for horses with Cushing's or PPID. Again, it doesn't sound like they need any calories, so that would be a great fit to balance out the forage that you're giving them. It would be good to note if this pony is insulin resistant or dysregulated, we may also want to think about the forage that you're feeding. So having your hay tested for the starch and sugar content and kind of targeting that below about 12% between the starch and sugar content would be another good aspect. Last but not least then, there was a question about a pony who gets antsy otherwise. Very good during work, but gets antsy. So it sounds like this pony knows his job, which is awesome, and behaves really well under saddle, but otherwise kind of antsy. And so looking a little bit at the diet, it looks like 6 quarts of feed per day. Probably, I'm guessing a pony hunter. It must be a little bit larger pony hunter. Anyway, what I would think about is lowering the starch and sugar content. So could you find a diet balancer to use and then pull in a fat source? There's a lot of fat supplements on the market made with, rice bran and flaxseed. Really good sources of fat and omega-6 and 3 fatty acid ratio being at a nice level there. So that would kind of be something I would target towards. And again, that's to reduce that starch and sugar in the diet, which can make for sometimes these more fractious, anxious horses with more energy. The research has kind of shown us that anytime you move a horse over to a lower starch and sugar, high fat feed, we generally see these calmer, more manageable horses. Not every horse, but most of them. So, I think we are actually approaching time here, so I'm going to cut it short. I appreciate everybody for jumping on. If you guys do have questions about a specific horse, an individual that you'd like us to help you with a consultation on, just hop on to the ProElite Facebook page and you can message us, or you can certainly go to ProEliteHorseFeed.com and there's an email us section at the bottom where you can shoot us a note. So I hope everybody fares well. I hope you've got good weather where you are, can get outside. And if you're able to be with your horses, please enjoy them for those who are not. So thinking of everybody, and thanks and have a great evening.